This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1061, a conversation with Robert Venditti.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1061. It's a conversation with Robert Venditti. Eagle-eyed listeners will know that Robert was actually on the show before. This would have been way back in July 2021, so just over 3 years ago, back on episode 890. At the time, we did a very deep dive into his work on DC's Hawkman, but for this episode, it was a little bit different. We talked about his work on Superman 78, specifically the first miniseries and the second one, which was known as The Metal Curtain. This was just such a breath of fresh air as a series. Two different artists. We talk about that through the episode, but Robert wrote it all, and he approached it with really a great sense of, there's just something, there's a je ne sais quoi about how he imbues his Clark and his Superman with very much the feeling of Christopher Reeve and the feeling you get from watching those original Superman movies. There's a warmth to the writing and in the way that the character is portrayed, and this definitely comes off in the art as well. So I'll let Robert talk about it more, but this is a really fun episode. I'm really glad that Robert was able to come on the show. Upcoming episodes, so we've got an episode with Tom Brennan coming up soon. He worked in editorial in the late 2000s at Marvel. He also did a really great interview over on the Amazing Spider Talk podcast at one point. So I definitely would recommend checking out that interview, and then also checking out my episode with Tom in 2 weeks. In a week. Upcoming episodes, I'm going to be talking with Joe Caramagna soon, who's a letterer predominantly on the Spider-Man books for a long time, but he letters a whole ton of stuff, as you can imagine, as letterers typically do end up working on a lot of different projects at the same time. We also have Jason Liebig coming back to the show soon, so I'm very excited about that. And then I think there's a couple other first-time guests that we're going to be having on the show soon. So a lot of exciting stuff to look forward to. Anyways, thanks for listening to this episode. You can email me at comicshenanigans@gmail.com, rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify. Thanks again for downloading and listening to this conversation with Robert Venditti. Enjoy. Robert, welcome back to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. How are you today?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me back, Adam.
Absolutely. I had a real treat talking to you last time. It was hard to believe it was 3 years ago. We were talking about a lot about Hawkman in that episode, but this episode, I want to talk about Superman 78, which is interesting because I think when we were chatting last time, I think either it had just been announced, but I don't think any of the books had actually come out yet. So I obviously, we're timing this episode to come out exactly when the new Metal Curtain trade paperback's coming out, but I also kind of want to go back to the first Superman 78. And so just as a reminder, how did this gig come about?
Well, I've worked for DC for years, and one of the editors that I've worked with a lot over there is Andrew Marino, who worked on a lot of my Green Lantern run, almost all of it, I think, Hawkman, Freedom Fighters, bunch of things. And over the years at DC, I didn't start reading comics until I was in my late 20s, right? And so over the years, it kind of just was like a joke that whenever somebody would ask me, do I want to pitch for a character, I would always say, I don't know anything about that character, but I'd research it, But everybody always knew that I'd started reading comics later, but that I had seen the Superman films, and Superman was my favorite character, and I had kind of grown up with that version of Superman being my Superman. Mm-hmm. So behind the scenes, when DC decided they were going to do a Superman 78 comic and also a Batman 89 comic, Andrew is the editor on those books. I might even be at the projects were his idea. He reached out to me and asked me if I'd be interested in writing them and what would I do with a project like that. And obviously I was extremely excited for that because, like I say, that's, some people, Dan Jurgens' Superman is their Superman, or John Byrne's Superman is their Superman. Christopher Reeve and Richard Donner's Superman is my Superman. So really, really excited for that opportunity, and we started putting it together from there.
Kind of interesting, actually, when I think about it, that like we got Batman 66 a long time ago, so I wonder why it took so long to get, Batman 89 and Superman 78, because you'd think that after the success of 66, it would have been a natural.
Yeah, and I even think that there was a Batman 89 sort of film novelization that was done in comics form, I think, so I don't know why there had never been a Superman 78 comic, but there hasn't, and so that was another reason why I was really excited.
So when you kind of do that initial pitch, like how much of your initial pitch ended up being what we saw in that first miniseries, or did it kind of evolve from there? Like how much of it was in that kind of initial genesis?
Yeah, Andrew just said to me that it was going to be a 6-issue miniseries and they wanted Brainiac to be the villain. Okay. And other than that, I put a pitch together, and what you see on the page is pretty close to what the pitch was, When I do that kind of pitch, I go issue by issue, what's going to happen, and, plot out each issue and things like that. And we stuck to it pretty closely. So it didn't really, in terms of story and plot, didn't really change a whole lot from pitch to what we actually ended up with on the page.
Now, at what point in the process, when you're, developing this, for the first series, do you find out who the artist is going to be? Like how early, when you were kind of starting to develop your script and your plot, when did you find out that Torres is going to be the artist?
That's a very good question. I don't know if I remember, to be honest. I know that, I want to say that Andrew had told me that he wanted Wilfredo to be the artist, but I don't know if Wilfredo had committed yet to it before I started writing, but certainly pretty early on in the process, Wilfredo was working on character sketches and things like that, I believe,
Now, what really blew me away with both miniseries is obviously, the attention to detail, but really getting these voices right. And obviously when you're working on something like this, which is again akin to the Batman 89 or the Batman 66, you really got to nail specific voices because these are very specific iterations of the characters. And obviously in the case of Superman, Christopher Reeve Superman is extremely well thought of and beloved. So obviously nailing that voice is very important. So was it very easy for you because you grew up such a huge fan and that is your Superman to tap into that voice, or did you kind of go through a lot of processes to kind of develop his exact voice?
Yeah, I think, like I say, because that was the first version of Superman that imprinted on me more than anything in the comics or anything like that. I just kind of sat down and watched the movies again, and which was pretty cool, right? Like this is my job, is to watch Superman 78, Superman 2 and everything. And I don't know. I think I just had those voices always in my head. I don't know, almost like when I read the comic, those are the voices I hear. You know what I'm saying? Because again, for me, the films are what imprinted on me before anything else did. And so those are the voices that I always had. And I don't know if maybe that, because it's what a lot of people have said, that from my side, I was able to capture the voice really well. From Wilfredo's side, he was able to capture the physical acting aspects really well and the mannerisms and expressions, And I think that's just because we're both of us, such huge fans of the films. And I don't know. I know this sounds maybe disingenuous, but it wasn't really hard to get into that headspace and find those voices. It was like they were there already,
I'm curious because, I'm guessing you went full script on this, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm curious because I feel like this is different than most projects where you have the full script, but when you have the pages coming from Wilfredo, did you find that you did more tweaking of dialogue to match certain mannerisms that he was able to then put on the page? Because obviously you have an idea of what you want the characters to be saying, but once you actually see it and you actually see this great interpretation of these characters that thus far were just on the screen before, and now you're seeing it on the page in front of you, did you find yourself adapting or changing the dialogue slightly to match some of the mannerisms that he was able to perfect in the art?
You always do a lettering pass, regardless of the book, like the lettering that you turn in your script when it goes to the artist is never the final lettering. As the art comes in, you go in and you do a lettering pass on the script again to try to, rework it to go with the art, before that goes to the letterer. And then after it comes back from the letterer, you'll go and you'll make notes again. I don't know if I had to do a lot of rewriting to match facial expressions because, again, I was seeing Gene Hackman say these lines and I was seeing Christopher Reeve say these lines in my head as I was writing them, you know. If I had to guess, and we're going back on the first book, you know, a few years now, if I had to guess, though, I went through and trimmed a lot of things out because Wilfredo's art, he's such a great storyteller in and of itself that it carries a lot of the story just through the acting and the expressions. And so more so than me rewriting dialogue so that it matches, it was more like me not having to say things because the art was already saying them, if that makes sense.
Oh, no, it does. Absolutely. When you know that Brainiac is going to be your main foe, was it pretty easy for you to be like, okay, well, I definitely have to use Jor-El. Like, I have to definitely go back and have, you know, the Kryptonians here. Like, was that a pretty easy jump for you? Like, when you're developing the plot, when you just know the villain, how easy was it for you to kind of be like, okay, here's the intricacies of what that means and where I'm going to take this character? Like, I'm just curious, like, how you break down, yes, I got Brainiac, but like, which version of Brainiac? How do I do Brainiac?
Yeah, so that was probably the biggest thing that we did, right? And so I sat down, I watched the movies, and I had decided I was going to try to set this movie between 2 and 3, Superman 2 and 3. It's not explicitly said, but in my head canon, you know, that's kind of where I was operating from, although I think it could work in other places too. I really tried to say, because you're doing a very specific thing, right? You're writing Superman, but you're writing a very specific version of Superman that was shown in those films. And so I really tried to think of this not as a Superman story, but as a Superman story set in the universe of those films. And I sat there and I tried to think about what might Donner have possibly been building toward. You know, Jor-El and Lara have a lot of screen time in the first movie, and they come back again and have screen time again in the second movie in various ways, you know, probably most memorably where Superman is speaking to his mother in that sort of crystal prison image, you know, that he talks to her. It's just a lot of screen time for a director like Donner to put there, and screenwriter Mario Puzo, let's not forget him, without there having been some kind of purpose for that, you know. And so that got me kind of thinking, well, what might that purpose have been? And that kind of is the train of thought that led me to the idea of, again, operating within the films and being free and only bound by the film continuity and not all the things that have happened in the comics. If we have Brainiac, this is an opportunity where Jor-El and Lara have survived, taken from Krypton by Brainiac just before the planet exploded and added to his bottle collection. And now this is something you could do in these films that you could never do in the comics. So it's unique to the films, but it also makes story sense with the films that have come before. And now it also gives you an opportunity to do something really emotional with Superman where he has to choose between, you know, the home of his lineage and his adopted home of Earth. And so that was kind of where the whole story grew out from there.
Mm-hmm. What I really appreciated about your take on Luthor was an interesting homogenization of, like, obviously very much the Gene Hackman Luthor, but then also leaning into the mad scientist that we don't get to see as much in the movies because of the very specific version that they wanted to focus on. So it was kind of an interesting fusion of different elements of Luthor, but still very much Gene Hackman. Like, you can, again, something about your scripting is very well on point that you can hear Gene Hackman saying these words. When he's talking about being this super criminal, like, it definitely feels like it jumps off the page in that way, but at the same time, you're adding in elements that we never really got to see in the films, and which is, again, much more of a Silver Age Superman villain.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like there was a bit of the mad scientist elements in those films for me. You know, he's got this whole thing in Superman 1 where he's, you know, gonna hijack the nuclear weapons to create a new coastline in California, and he's got the screaming radio thing, and he's only allowed to speak on Superman's frequency. And then in Superman 2, he creates the hologram projector in his cell so that it, you know, him and Otis can try to escape, and of course Otis doesn't make it, but he does. You know, so I feel like there was that mad scientist aspect of him enough for me to lean into some of those things,
That's interesting. I guess that's true. I do like that there was one line of dialogue when Metropolis is dropping, and you do have Luthor say something about how the Metropolis real estate market's about to crash, which is, again, a fun kind of dark thing for him to say, but also given how much of his scheme in the first movie is about real estate, I thought was a nice nod.
Yeah, we really tried to do that a lot with the story. We tried to have little callbacks in dialogue somewhere, and Wilfredo certainly does an excellent job putting little Easter eggs in the art and things like that, So yeah, we definitely tried to have some fun with those things, and that was all very intentional. I think we make a real estate crack in the second book too, if I remember right, from Lex. But yeah, we definitely tried to do some of that stuff.
One thing I thought was interesting, and I guess it comes to this idea of nailing the voices and also the economy of language, is that at times I liked how you didn't have the dialogue wasn't going too far in terms of it wasn't trying to cram too much dialogue in. Like, you had Superman was actually not curt, that's the wrong word, but judicious with his words. And I actually thought that really worked well for the character and how he came across, because his words meant more because he said less, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I feel like Christopher Reeve was like that in the movies too. I don't really recall in Superman 1 and 2 him doing any great soliloquies, Christopher Reeve was such a great expressive actor, and obviously very famously was able to transform from Clark Kent into Superman in a way that you actually believe how Superman could be walking around the Daily Planet and nobody know that it was him, which is very, very hard to do. And comics have a really hard time doing that too. And Wilfredo was able to capture that slouched posture and those swinging arms and, that downward gaze and all these things that Christopher Reeve would use in the movie. And then, when he becomes Superman, he straightens up and he broadens his shoulders and you can see the transformation. I mean, there's a very famous scene. Everybody listening to this knows very well. There's a very famous scene where you watch him make that transformation as an actor in real time in the span of a couple beats. And it's really phenomenal. And so, I feel like Christopher Reeve was an actor who let his expressiveness do a lot of the talking for him. And, he doesn't have some big lines of dialogue. He just says, General, would you care to step outside? You know what I'm saying? And it's just a few words, but there's 1,000 words behind them based on how he acts, and, we tried to stay true to that,
And Wilfredo obviously does an amazing job in that first series of, it's such an interesting line to toe when you're doing a character that is obviously based on an interpretation. So it needs to look like Christopher Reeve, but not look too much like Christopher Reeve. Like, you don't want it to look stilted. You don't want it to look like doesn't have a sense of movement. And obviously that's what comics do so well, is having that sense of, that there is this, bombast to what is really just a still panel, but you'd swear it was moving. And yet he does such a great job of, as I said, kind of towing that line where it feels like Christopher Reeve, but he's not just doing stills from a movie. Like, he really is doing a great job of portraying, poetry in motion in terms of how Superman moves and how the story really comes alive.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say enough good things about Wilfredo, and not just as an artist, but as a collaborator and just as a person. I didn't know him before this project, and just a really good guy and very smart storyteller, highly skilled, as you're able to see, and you can really feel the love he puts into every panel. He didn't cut any corners. He didn't do any cheats. I mean, it's all there. And even with something like Brainiac's design, I didn't have an idea in mind of who the air quotes actor would be, for Brainiac or whatever. It was his idea to do David Bowie. And as soon as I saw that, I was just, I'm a huge Bowie fan, and it's like, of course, that makes so much sense when you think about Bowie and how aloof he could be and, how intelligent he was and everything, and just a perfect person for Brainiac. And so, that's just all Wilfredo and his creativity and his own storytelling sensibilities. It's one of my favorite projects that I've ever been able to work on. And, that's in no small part because of my chance to work with him and what he was able to do.
Now, did you get the opportunity to get any of the original pages from Superman 78, the first series?
I did. Yeah, I did get a page, which was not easy. Wilfredo was very generous about that because, as I'm sure you imagine, there's a huge fan base for the film, and the fan base was very, very supportive of the comic right from the jump, which was a kind of a high pressure thing. I mean, they've been waiting 50 years almost for something like this, and it hadn't happened. And so, a little nerve wracking, are we going to screw this up or are we going to hit it right? And, the fan base from the films was on board immediately and really, really liked what we were doing, which was a great feeling. And, they were snapping up the art pretty quick, but I was able to get a page, that I'm very, very happy with. And, it's definitely going up on my office wall. I got a bunch of stuff at the frame shop, so yeah.
Which issue is the page from?
It is issue 2. It is when. Wait, is it issue 2? I believe, yeah, it's issue 2. Here, I'll tell you. I don't have it in front of me. I don't know the page number, but I can pull it up on my computer and tell you. It's issue 2. When he's fighting all of the Brainiac drones, and there's a scene where he crashes a drone into the ground, and he's like the smoke is clearing, and he's standing there with the skull of it in his hand. This is page 14 of issue 2. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So it's got Lois, it's got Jimmy, it's got Perry, it's got a nice shot of Superman. It's even got Brainiac in there, so it's got everybody but Lex.
That's a pretty good page.
Yeah, it's a great page. Yeah. Very, very happy with it.
So at what point after this, as the series is going, and, I believe it was doing fairly well, at what point do you get contacted about, it did well enough, let's do a sequel? Is it as you guys are rolling out the first, or was there kind of obviously from a publishing perspective, there was a bit of a gap of about, I think, a year and a half, but in terms of you actually working on it or knowing it was going to come down the line, at what point do you know that a second series is coming?
Yeah, it was pretty quick. The first series was very, very well received, and I mean, it's still in hardcover. It's not even in trade paperback yet. The hardcover's been out, I think, a couple of years, so sales on it were really, really good. And so it was pretty early on that we knew we were going to do a second one, and that's what ended up becoming the Metal Curtain. Wilfredo wasn't able to come back for the second one because he already had commitments elsewhere. But we had Gavin Guidry do the second one, and it was great having a chance to work with him. He loves these characters too, and he brought such a heartwarming quality to his art. His versions of the characters are very endearing, and I think that captures the tone of what those films were. A lot of people, as we sit here and we look back across the decades, right? I think people call these comic book films, Superman 78, Superman 2. I think if you go back and you think of them at the time, though, the notion of a comic book film didn't exist. This is Richard Donner. This is Mario Puzo, screenwriter of Godfather, Christopher Reeve, Gene Hackman. I mean, these are titans of the business. This is a film. These are films. They weren't thought of as comic book films. They were films. And the quality and the tone of those films holds up even today, where I think it's one of the rare cases where Christopher Reeve is the definitive version of Superman. Like, if you go anywhere in the world and you say Superman, people are going to say Christopher Reeve in a way they might not for Tobey Maguire and Spider-Man or, things like that. Even Batman, I think a lot of people still imprint the Batman 66 TV show, maybe, this is the definitive version of the character. The tone is very specific, and Gavin's art is a great match for that tone. You get that warmth and that sense of hope on the page that you get when you view those films.
Absolutely. Now, it's curious, like, again, it's an interesting study in being able to really make use of the time period, because obviously you're able to kind of go back and use the USSR and use, and kind of take things in a different direction. Did you have, obviously, when you first signed on for the first miniseries, they knew that they wanted to do Brainiac. When you guys start talking about doing a second series, were you given more of a kind of wide berth to kind of choose what you wanted to go in, or is it coming more from editorial as well?
No, Metallo was my idea for the second one. I thought for films of those eras, late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s, even late 80s, for film franchises of those areas, of that era, the Soviets always popped up somewhere, and so I always thought it was interesting that there was never a Cold War film in the Superman franchise. I mean, with Quest for Peace, there's obviously a nuclear armament kind of film, but it wasn't, it wasn't the Soviets and things like that, and so it seemed like something that, again, operating within the universe of the films and not the comics, already taking continuity that's been established in certain things, like Lex Luthor establishing in the first film that there was more than one chunk of kryptonite that landed on Earth, right? And like they find the one in Ethiopia, and that's how he gets the thing that he puts around his neck and Superman's neck, and just pulling on little threads like that. What if a chunk of kryptonite landed in the Soviet Union at the same time that Superman landed in Kansas, and they've been building this, program all along for an armored soldier that could defeat Superman, and it's called, Project Metallo, and so that was kind of where that story grew out of.
It's a smart use of the type of character, and again, being able to kind of use the surrounding context and time period that you're playing in. And so it felt very natural, that's something that Superman would go up against. And so even seeing how he wanted to combat Metallo and how that would work is pretty cool. At what point were you like, you know what, I want to use Sam Lane. I want him to be in this book.
Oh, yeah, early on for sure. If you're doing something military, I felt like you would have to have that, and we wanted to get Lex back in there again, start building out this cast in this universe in the films in those ways. I thought the idea of, Superman having to meet essentially his girlfriend's father for the first time for somebody with Kansas values would be interesting to play with. Like I say, there's the military aspect, the Cold War aspect. We tried to throw a little espionage in there, and also, unlike a lot in the films and in comics and things, Metallo is a villain that he can't beat. Like he can't win in a fight against Metallo. And he doesn't in the comic. He beats. Air quotes around beats, but he defeats Metallo in a different way. He does it with his heart, and that was something that I was really, really happy with about the second series, that I think there's a temptation with Superman to always create villains, just make the punch fests bigger, and it's just, he digs deeper and punches a little bit harder, To me, the trick about writing Superman is to put him in situations that he can't punch his way out of, Here he is in Brainiac's bottle, and he has to choose. Do I stay with my parents from Krypton, or do I try to escape and get back to Earth and defend my adopted home? Like that's not a situation you can punch your way out of, With Metallo, like, how do I beat this villain who's powered by the very thing that can kill me? And it's impossible for me to punch my way through this. So how do I defeat Metallo, And those are the things. That's the trick to writing Superman, more than just coming up with bigger things for him to punch.
It's interesting because I think because you're using the Christopher Reeve Superman, he looks like that Superman, you're tapping into that voice. I think that sense of leading with heart first comes forth even more because there's just, as you said before, about, the way that Christopher Reeve embodied that character. You believed that he wanted the best for people and that he would see the best in people. Like, he just something about how he brought that character to life is that you believe that he leads with his heart first. And so when you have your character doing that, it feels very authentic, not just the idea of Superman, because he always should be doing that anyway, but there's something extra about it when the visual on the page is Chris Reeve and you're tapping into that voice.
Yeah, and that little half smile that Christopher Reeve would flash that would just melt you, And, I don't know. To me, I think that's what Superman's all about. You know, a lot of people say Superman's corny, and they find it unbelievable that somebody with power would do something right simply because it's the right thing to do. I think that's such a sad view on the world. You know, I think this is what drew me to Superman when I saw it in the theater as a child, is it just tapped into this way that I kind of wanted to be myself. Like, I always try to see the best in people. And, I believe that mankind is inherently good. And, you know, there's a moment in the first story where Brainiac, I can't remember the exact wordage, Brainiac is saying, you know, how do you find good in these people, you know, in this planet, you know? And Superman says, I fell out of the sky and landed on Earth, and the first two people that found me adopted me and loved me as their own. Like, how could I not see good, you know? And, Superman, I think, as a character, just carries that with him everywhere. He always sees the good in people, even the bad ones. He hasn't given up on Lex. He doesn't give up on Metallo. And when he gets to the point in the story where as at this moment where they're fighting in Gorky Park now in Moscow, and he's just not going to beat Metallo, you know, and Metallo is just beating him and blasting away with his kryptonite radiation, and he's just like, he says to Superman, how did you ever believe you could win? And Superman says, it's because it's not me I believe in you. You know, he's basically saying somewhere in you there is still goodness, because you're a human and people are good. And that's how he finally ends up getting through to Metallo. Like, not through punching him or whatever, but just being this person who believes in good. And in that moment, Metallo has to accept that this guy isn't the evil thing that my masters in the Soviet army have led me to believe that he is, you know. And that's kind of when the fight turns.
Sure. Oh, I mean, even earlier in that fight, like, you have that moment where Superman is smashed into that column, and there's that, like, the family, right? And there's that little girl, and he saves her anyway, and he's like, it's going to be all right. And again, just that moment in the art where he gives that kind of smile, that reassuring look, right? He's in the middle of a fight. He should be focusing on the fight, but yet he always cares about civilians. He always cares about other people that could get hurt. It doesn't matter which country they're in. If someone's going to get hurt, he's going to protect them.
Exactly.
Something about, you mentioned earlier the idea, which is kind of fun to play with, is, you know, Superman meeting his girlfriend's dad. Like, that's a fun kind of trope to play with. What I really liked about that moment is when you have Superman fly away and Sam's still talking, and the highball thinks it's talking to him. He's like, no, I'm not talking to you. Like, he knows that Superman can hear him, and just because he knows what Lois sees in him doesn't mean he has his blessing. I really like that moment. It's a very quiet moment, but it's a really, really nice moment.
Yeah, just humanize Sam a little bit. I mean, he's a general and he's doing all these things, but he's also the father of a daughter, you know. And I think it's just something that you always want to find with stories that you're writing, you know, no matter how far-fetched they are in terms of conceit, you know, superheroes or science fiction or, you know, fantasy or whatever. You always want to find those things that make the characters relatable to your readers, even if your reader's not a general whose daughter is dating a alien superhero. You know what I mean? Like, what are those beats that everybody can relate to? And, you know, that would be one where I would, you know, try to do with Sam Lane, to try to humanize things and give the reader something to stand on and something that they can kind of ground themselves in the story and go along for the ride with all the more fantastic things that happen.
I think it's in the second issue where you have a really nice human moment where, you know, Superman's got Lois in the Fortress of Solitude. He's ready to reveal himself again, right? Like, he gets dressed. He's like, this is my moment. And then obviously, you know, he has to go protect, end up saving Highball from Metallo when Metallo first shows up. It's a great character beat, but especially for, you know, again, a melding between you and the artist, because, it's really well paced. There's a couple panels where there's no dialogue at all. But also the dialogue that you use is very much like, you can feel Clark struggling with like, I want to do this. I want to do this again. I want to do this right. And then also then being torn away from the moment. It's just a really nice sequence where Lois is just kind of doing her own thing and Clark's just like readying himself up for something. And so it's a great synthesis between the dialogue that you're giving Superman so you really understand what he's thinking, what he's going through there. And then also the art is just superb in really demonstrating physically how he feels as he's psyching himself up for this moment.
Yeah. Again, just humanizing and also playing, obviously on the beat from Superman 1 where he's, Lois, I have to tell you something. And this is kind of the reverse, and he's already Superman. And so he gets dressed as Clark to go out and do his reveal in the Fortress of Solitude. And so it's kind of the reverse of that beat, just trying to put those human moments in there, but also when you can make nods to what's come before in the films and make it all feel like it's happening in the same universe and past events have informed this story in some way and this story will inform future events and things like that,
I'm curious about your use of Luthor in the second series because did you have a feeling like, should I be like, obviously you use him judiciously, and I actually appreciate that about the first series too, is that you use him when it's necessary, but he's not the main character, he's not the main villain or antagonist, but he's playing a role and he's in this world. But when you were developing the storyline for Metal Curtain, did you think about not using Lex because you just used him, or was it more of a, well, I have this character, he exists in this world, of course he should be involved, but obviously to which degree you get to kind of play with?
Yeah, I would say this is different from Lex Luthor in the comics for sure, but I see Lex Luthor as a key supporting cast member in the Superman films, He's not the main villain in Superman 2, but he's a supporting cast member who plays a role in some way, and I wanted to keep that going. Otherwise it's a very small cast, right? It's Superman, it's Perry, it's Jimmy, it's Lois and maybe a little bit of Ma Kent, in the first film. But that's it. So to broaden out that cast some, I feel like Lex is a key member there. And again, keeps reminding you, whether you're saying it overtly or not, that Superman hasn't given up on Lex either because he sees the good in people and he believes even the bad ones have that little bit of good in there waiting to get out, and so it kind of taps into that subtext about the character.
Now, did you end up with a Gavin page from the series?
I did. The page that I got it's issue 6. I'll look it up.
Is it the I Believe in You? Because, that's a
No, I would never. Yeah, obviously that's great, but I'm sure he made a fortune on that page and deservedly so. The one I got is close to that. It is the one where the little girl grabs, let's see. I think it's page 12. Yeah, it's page 12. Yeah. It's got Metallo, it's got the little girl, it's got Superman, That's the page I took. Yeah.
Very nice. Yeah, it was an incredibly fun book, and again, I'm not even sure which one I like more of the two because they're such well designed and really fun yarns. And I'm going to say something, and it sounds like a negative, but it's really not. But what I like about it is that this is an all ages comic. I can read it. Anyone could read this. They might.
Well, that's never a negative. I think it's sad that we live in a world where people think that's a negative. I'm not saying you do, but that can be some kind of, pejorative, No, absolutely. Superman 78 and Superman 2 are, I saw those movies when I was very, very young and I got everything I needed to get out of them as a kid. But obviously my parents are older and they got the adult things out of them, so it's very much, again, trying to capture that same tone and that same type of storytelling in the comics that they had in the films. And so, yeah, that's great. That's exactly what we were trying to do. We want anybody to be able to read these stories and leave having felt like they just read a really, really good Superman story that doesn't just take place in the universe of the films, but is really true to the core concept of what the Superman character stands for, be it comics, be it animation, be it film, be it whatever. Like, this is the characteristics in these stories are what I see as the beating heart of the character, you know, in whatever version. If somebody asked me to write a main Superman story, it would be this kind of version of this type of character. It would not be some dark, you know, laser eye Superman or whatever, you know, like that's just not it for me. And that's not to criticize other people's stories. I mean, everybody has their own aesthetic and their own point of view that they come from. That's just not my point of view, and that's fine. But my point of view would be very much this point of view on the character. And I think it's borne out again by the idea of, you know, anywhere you go in the world and you say Superman, people think of this version of Superman. I think that kind of bears out the idea that that beating heart of the character is what resonates with people, you know?
Yeah, he's definitely one of those transcendent castings, which it's hard to separate the two in people's minds. And you're right, it's kind of singular because it's not that way with Batman. I mean, as you said, like, there's a lot of people like Batman 66 is going to be their Batman, but there's at least been, you know, a lot of different interpretations of Batman, that there's a lot of different people who've grown up with different ones, and it's easy to see, okay, well, that's their Batman, I get it. I don't think that exists in the same way with Superman. I think even for a lot of people, even who grew up more recently, they're still, if they've seen the Christopher Reeve movies, it's going to take over as their Superman. Like, there's just something inherent in his interpretation of the character and how those films approached it. And as you said, it was just trying to make a movie. It was trying to make a good movie. It wasn't, you know, it really wasn't apologizing for itself.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Now, when this next question is on two levels. The first question is, as a writer in general, do you write with silence? Do you write with music around you? Like, what is your method? And then I guess the branch off from there is that when you're writing something like this, which is steeped in a very specific feel and period and atmosphere, do you put on some John Williams Superman?
No, yeah. I wish I could, but I write in silence pretty much, you know, yeah. Like, it's very hard for me to listen to music or have a TV on or whatever. Like I say, I wish I could listen to music while I wrote, but I don't know. It just ends up being distracting, and I end up thinking about the song and getting caught up in the song rather than thinking about what I'm writing. So I'm pretty much in the quiet when I'm writing, you know.
Now, when you're writing dialogue that, again, is very specific to this certain voice patterns like Christopher Reeve or Gene Hackman, do you say it out loud as you read through it? Like, you know, you're writing it. Do you ever kind of try to verbalize it, almost doing that voice to kind of hear it in your head? Or do you not have to do that because it's already kind of ingrained in you?
I don't act it out, but yeah, I do read it out loud. Like, the out loud test is a very important part of writing. You know, if you read it out loud and your tongue trips up on the words and the way it's phrased, then the reader's going to trip up on it too, you know. And so the out loud test is something I do for all the stories that I do.
Now, I guess you can't really probably say anything about if we're going to get more Superman 78, but I'm guessing if they asked you, you would do more, right?
I would do more, and we're already talking about doing a third volume. So yeah, I'm hoping that we're able to do that.
Now, it's interesting because I'm curious, like, has there ever been a discussion about just having it be an ongoing in that universe, just more for the ability to kind of, you know, layer out subplots in a different way? Obviously, like, when you're within a certain structure, there's only so much you can kind of introduce because you have to kind of bring things to a close in some way after the 6 issues or however many issues you're afforded. So has there ever been a discussion about what if this was just a little bit more open-ended and we could do more of the world building and kind of keep things going?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what their discussions are internally. For me, as I think about the stories, I like the idea that they're miniseries because it feels like a film, you know? Mm-hmm. You get a story experience, then you get a break, and then you go back just like you would with the pacing of those films back in the day, you know? So that doesn't bother me. I think if I sort of had a dream for where I would want it to go long term, you know, I would love to do a series where it was Superman 78, Batman 89, Wonder Woman 77, Flash 90, and, you know, you've got kind of a Justice League there. I would love to do something like that.
I guess that brings up a question too. Like, was there ever any either thought from you or any discussions with your editor about, like, we're doing, these stories that are more or less set in this world, but are the other heroes something that you can bring in, or would that dilute the focus on what you're really trying to do, which is tell a solid Superman story?
Yeah, no, we've had those discussions, and I guess I would just say to stay tuned on something like that.
Fair enough. Now, with the upcoming, this is coming out in collected edition shortly. Is there any kind of extra material that we can look forward to in this, or is it just a straight kind of the 6 issues?
I think it's the story. Yeah, there might be some design work and things like that. Character designs and stuff at the back, but it's primarily the story. Yeah.
Anything I haven't asked you about that you're like, I thought he would ask me about this, about these particular miniseries?
I don't think so. I think you covered a pretty good amount of it. Yeah.
So as a reader, I have to thank you for your tremendous work here. It's been such a blast to read. I was talking about it with a friend and fellow podcaster yesterday, and we were talking about how, as I've kind of talked about, the sense of hope that you really kind of infuse into these stories, that it feels like Superman, he acts like Superman. It's a very, lovingly crafted story. And again, the art on both volumes has been phenomenal. And so even though you have 2 different artists, it still feels very much of that world, and they work together very well in succession. So again, just as a fan, a big thank you for the dedication and really the work you put in here, because obviously this was a passion project. This was something that you really wanted to do an amazing job on, and I would say you succeeded.
I appreciate that. Thanks so much. It's such a joy to work on these, and you never know how things are going to go, but couldn't be happier with how everything turned out.
Is there anything else you want to kind of plug or tell us about upcoming projects that we're allowed to know about that is not too early in the process? Or
yeah, I mean, I'm talking to DC about some things that haven't been announced yet, but I've got a lot of projects with Bad Idea that they're starting to roll out announcements on. There's Planet Death, which is a sci-fi war story I'm doing with Derek Kolstad, who's the writer of the John Wick films. Then there's and the artist is Tomas Girillo, and then there's a sort of more grounded story called Ordained that I'm doing with Raoul Allen. That's a story about a priest who gives last rites to a patient at a hospital, and he, during the confession, finds out that the patient is actually an Irish gangster. But then the patient ends up surviving the night and makes a miraculous turn, and they're going to live now. So the gangster wants to kill the priest because the priest knows all the secrets. So that's also a Bad Idea book. And then another one is called Survive, which is more of an espionage story about a American spy and a Russian sailor trapped aboard a Russian submarine sunk at the bottom of the Atlantic, and them trying to fight each other while at the same time trying to escape. So all those things are coming out.
Very nice. And actually, I didn't ask but obviously it has happened in the last couple of years after our last interview. But I was working on the Wesley Dodds book.
Oh, I loved working on that book. Riley is amazing. Any chance I can get to work on the JSA characters, I'm thrilled to do so. I worked on Hawkman for quite a while. Loved working on Sandman. Would love to do a Wildcat story or an Owlman story one day. So anytime I get a chance to do those characters, I'm thrilled to do it. The JSA and Nightwing are probably the two big things at DC that I've never worked on that I would love to work on.
I'll let you go in a moment because I know I promised I would. But with that Wesley Dodds book, I mean, it was just so much fun to read, and what a great artist you had paired with you as well. What is it about Wesley Dodds that really spoke to you?
I just like the JSA characters, but also I like the pulp tradition of Wesley Dodds. I grew up with my grandfather telling me about the Shadow radio show and things like that, and I like that aspect of it. I love setting it where we did, pre-World War II. Again, very close with my grandparents and hearing the stories about that time when they were younger. And I just find Wesley Dodds interesting. Like, why sleep gas? It seems, a bit hokey by today's standards. And so I really wanted to delve into why sleep gas. Well, it's because he's a pacifist and he's trying to come up with a method of humane conflict resolution. And in doing so, he created all these other toxic things that are failures on his way to creating a sleep gas that would do no harm. But along the way, he recorded all those failures in his journal, and now that journal gets stolen, and he has to get it back before it's sold to the highest bidder, as World War II was already starting to spread across Europe. And so that was kind of the idea behind that first story.
In the last page of that last issue, when you have Riley drawing the Justice Society, which is such a fun image, it's such a great, full page. Are we going to get more in this, from this? And
yeah, like I say, I would love to, but that's up to DC. It's definitely hard with some of the smaller characters like that, that aren't those, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Justice League. It's definitely difficult to put together runs on characters like that in this day and age, I think. And so I would love to do more, but that's up to DC.
Obviously you did so much amazing work on kind of a more modern day Hawkman. What would a World War II Hawkman book look like from you?
I don't think I'm going to tell you. Who knows if I get to do it one day, I have a World War II book with the entire JSA in mind, the Spectre, Alan Scott, Jay Garrick, Hawkman, Hourman, all of them. So, who knows if I'll get to do something like that one day.
When it came to that page by Riley in the last page of the Sandman book, the interpretation that he had of the Spectre was the one I was most I want to see more of that.
Yeah.
Because it was such an interesting, because we usually see the Spectre looking a certain way. And so seeing him kind of bent over and it just was not what I'm used to seeing from the Spectre. And I just was so taken by it. I was I want to see more of this because this feels like there's a story here.
Yeah, no, I agree. Riley's amazing. I love the expressiveness he does to his characters. I love the stylistic tone of his art. I just love that kind of stuff. And so, I would love to work with him again if the chance ever came.
I was impressed that DC also gave you 6 issues because a Sandman book doesn't feel like something they would give that long a leash to. And that's not in any way an indictment on you. It just more feels like a character that would get 4 issues, not 6. So I'm glad that they afforded you, extra, real estate to really tell a bigger story.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Do they do things less than 6 issues? I think that's kind of a standard maybe for them.
No, I guess you're right. Maybe I'm thinking more Marvel, because I think maybe more Marvel is more of a 4 thing. But 6 issues just felt like that's more of a bigger investment in the character, which I very much appreciated. But I was also Sandman gets this. This is great. There's a lot of characters who don't get 6-issue books at all.
Yeah, no, I love doing those kind of format stories. Obviously I've done a lot of ongoing series, it's what I do, 87 issues of Green Lantern, and 57 issues of X-Men Man of War, and that's one kind of storytelling, but it's nice to also to be able to do self-contained storytelling sometimes where there's a beginning, a middle, and the end, and you get to tell the whole thing,
Absolutely. Well, again, Robert, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today and doing a deep dive into your Superman 78 stuff. It was a great pleasure to be able to talk to you about it. And as I said, I really enjoyed your work on the book, so it was just fantastic. So I do hope that there is more because it's been such a joy to read.
Thank you so much, Adam. I appreciate that. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and thanks for having me on to talk about it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.